Okay, so I want to start off tonight with a little presentation. So last year, I challenged everyone in the church to read through the Bible in a year, and there were only a handful that told me that they had taken me up on the challenge, and I had promised that anyone that was going to do it, if they would let me know, and then if they actually did do it, and kind of check progress as we're going along, then I would have something for them the next year. And I made that promise from the pulpit. I always keep my promises. And so the only person to go all the way through the whole year and to do it was Jan Ledwith. And and so I have this book for her. It's How We Got the Bible, and it's a nice visual picture type book. It's also scholarly in the sense that it kind of fits through, but it gets through the whole development of the Bible. So there you go, Jet. I present that to you.
Thank you very much. Was a challenge.
Okay. So online we got Ann Roberts, we got Gail and Avon, we got Deb Elmeyer, Susan Fronberger. Oh, Susan just turned on her camera. It's looking at her table. She has hearts on her table. Okay, and we got Linda and Chris Welch. There's Chris sneaking up behind Linda. I see him now. Okay. And we got Sherry Watson also online. So that you guys know who's all here in person. You got obviously myself. We got Jan Ledwith. We got Anna Marcia Crawley. And we got Steve Miller, and we got Joe and Beth Derrick. They're the ones that are all here today. So if you're online, what I would ask is that you just keep yourself muted until you want to speak. And then that way they won't produce any feedback or anything like that as we're going along. Just so that for prayer concerns and prayer requests, so that John Myra, he's had kind of a negative reaction to his treatment. And so ask that really be in prayer for him. His stomach kind of got bloated a little bit, and he has a bad rash. He has a little pain. And also for Donna, Donna has maybe she might need surgery on her rotator cuff. So yeah, they're just in a lot of pain, so I ask that you be there. Also, another update is Henrietta Kresge. She had to put her dog down recently, and that's kind of we get very, very attached to our animals, and she's had the dog for 14 years, and given all the other things going on in their lives and everything, that dog really played a very special role in kind of loving them both unconditionally and being there for them. So one should be in prayer for them also. Other than that, all the other prayer concerns are pretty much the same. I'm just trying to hit the real major highlights. But does anyone else have any other prayer concerns or prayer requests before we go on?
Not a health issue, but Shelley texted me.
Yeah.
She's having a hard time getting this paper started, one of her final project paper.
Shelley?
Yeah, she just came up with the words. She said she wrote a whole paragraph and then looked at it and scribbled it all out. I guess it's...
Yeah, so Shelley Miller, she's in her she's in a doctoral program for her doctorate of ministry, and We obviously always want to keep her in prayer. That can be there's kind of light years difference between a master's degree program and a doctoral program, and in how the professors approach things and stuff. So it causes a lot of trepidation. Been there, done that, understand. Yep. But this too will pass and she'll get through it, I'm sure. Any other prayer concerns or prayer requests?
I have, just my pastor's wife, Kim Khan. They have 2 young children, they're 4 and 7, and she was just diagnosed on Thursday with cancer of the uterus. So, if we could include her, I would appreciate it.
Could you just say the name again, please?
Kim Khan, C-A-H-N.
Okay, Kim Khan.
Thank you.
Absolutely, Susan. Okay. Well, Joe, could you open us up in a word of prayer, please?
Sure. Lord, thanks for bringing us all together tonight safely and sound, and thank you for impressing upon our hearts the need for prayer and how we need to keep lifting each other up in hard times and good times. Thanks for Pastor Jeff leading this study tonight, and speak to our hearts in Jesus' name.
Okay. Alrighty, so here we go. We're gonna get started. So we're jumping into Genesis, and gee golly whiz, I'll be right back. I just realized I don't have my Bible with me.
Right here.
Here's a Bible.
There.
Pastor.
Here.
He ain't gonna hear us. You have to do a running down tackling.
Okay, he's not gonna find
Just
it.
tell him you used your Jedi powers, Bethany.
Okay.
No, I got him.
She's supposed to walk more.
Oh.
Aren't you, Beth?
What?
You're supposed to walk more.
I'm supposed to walk.
Okay. I was about to say, I thought I brought it in, then I didn't see it there.
Beth hit it on you.
Okay, aren't we off to a good start? So here we are. Now what we're gonna do is we're gonna finish up the entire book of Genesis tonight. And remember what I said, this is not a detailed study of every single verse in the Bible. What we're doing is we're surveying the different books of the Bible. And so and focusing on kind of like main pieces as we're going through each of the books. Okay, but if you follow along and you continue to do the reading, especially the reading in the newsletter has a chronological reading list that's listed in it. If you look like in the February newsletter, you'd see, if you're following along with that reading, you'll get through the whole Bible. And that's basically the same list that we're following in this study also. Okay? So, to pick up where we left off last week, we're talking about Abraham. Now, Abraham finally has Isaac. Okay? So, his wife Sarah finally has her son, and it's Isaac. And the main part that happens here with Isaac comes at a time when God told Abraham, okay, the covenant and everything's going to go through Isaac, but then God all of a sudden takes Abraham and he tests him. And he says, okay, I want you to take your one and only son and go sacrifice him. And he directs him to the place he's supposed to go, and Abraham goes there. And we have a very vivid scene of Abraham binding up Isaac, laying him on the altar, and then about to sacrifice him, and Abraham is stopped by an angel. And then God provides a ram that's caught in a thicket. Now, in a class I once had on Genesis and everything, the professor asked us what we thought about that, and if how would we put it in a modern version or so, and I said that what would happen is, of course, Child Youth Services would get involved and Abraham would lose custody
And we would be arrested.
right away. There's so much in that story and what happens that it just seems so offensive to who we are. I mean, this idea of God saying, go do a human sacrifice, this idea of Abraham just saying, okay, and going off and doing it. And it really stands out and hits us hard. What do you make of it? Throw that question out. What do you see in that story? How do you deal with it?
He didn't ask Abraham to do something that he wasn't gonna do himself because of Christ.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Okay. But yeah, that's still a long ways away.
Yeah.
Mhm.
But he doesn't ask us to do anything that is not feasible,
Okay?
although sacrificing your child is kind of really testing.
Mhm.
I can,
Yeah. But so so you just see it, okay, there was nothing wrong with God asking this.
oh, of course there was something wrong. Yes.
I mean, what do you make of this? It's
Well,
yeah.
I mean, this event was very powerful because it showed Abraham's total obedience to God, because he was willing to make the
Abraham's obedience
sacrifice.
to God.
Personally, I'm not sure if I would be able to sacrifice.
She's not sure if she would be able to sacrifice.
Yeah, just so you know, Anna, and I'm having someone tell me what you're saying, because Audrey's not here to sign at me, and I'm using my phone right now, so I lost all my captioning ability too.
Okay.
So that's all that's going on, since I can't see you. But so okay, right? There's the thing about being obedient to God. That God lays out this unbelievably difficult task. And God ends up being obedient. So right at the beginning of chapter 22, we're told that the very first verse there, it says, after these things, God tested Abraham. So we're told up front that this is a test of his faith, to see if Abraham loves God more than anything else. And also, though, a test that Abraham believes God. God's already told him, your covenant, the covenant is going to go through Isaac. So somehow that's going to transpire no matter what.
God didn't tell him exactly where he was gonna go, right? He was led by God to the spot where he was gonna sacrifice.
Right.
So God may have not told him, or maybe he did show him, and it wasn't that short of a distance either, from what I understand.
No, it was a destiny. He goes with some
Yeah.
servants.
He goes with some servants.
I
Right.
think it was, he didn't have to dwell with that thought that I have to kill my son as a sacrifice that whole trip.
Well,
didn't-
he tells him straight up, take your son and go sacrifice him.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, he did say that.
He did
Right
say
in the
that,
very
yeah.
beginning.
Yeah.
my
He
bad.
says
Yeah.
right in the very beginning, Abraham here, and he says, here I am. He said, take your son, your only
Yeah.
son
Yeah,
Isaac,
he did, yeah.
whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah
Mhm.
and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains that I'll show you.
I just-
Do you think God gave him Isaac? God gave him Isaac. They laughed and they said, well, you know, we're too old and things like that. But basically Isaac was God's anyway. God's gift to Abraham.
Yeah.
So he could basically do with Isaac what he wanted or his plan. To me, that's the way things shaped up, was the fact that Isaac wasn't actually Abraham. God told Abraham he's gonna make a nation out of Isaac.
Right, and so you see, so even though this seems totally contradictory thing, this is testing Abraham's faith, that
Mhm.
Abraham believes
Yeah.
everything that God's told him.
Do you really believe me? After I told
Right.
you I was going, yeah, you're right. You know.
And so Abraham, even though it doesn't totally make sense, okay, I know somehow Isaac's gonna stay alive, and this covenant's still gonna go through him, because God said so.
Mhm.
And so Abraham carries it out. And we get a hint of this also later on in there, where he says, when they came to the place that God had shown him, Abraham built an altar there and he put the word, the verse before that, verse 8. Abraham said, God himself will provide a lamb for the burnt offering, my son. Because his son ain't clueless. His son says, hey, Dad, where's the offering here? We got everything but that. And Abraham in that thing, again expresses a thing of faith. Hey, God's going to provide. I'm sure of it. And in the end, God does provide. So,
Right, but you know
yeah.
what? The fact that Isaac let him tie him up and get on this altar, because they went back to that point. Sometimes, of course, it's hard to understand things, especially things that happened back in those days. But God knows everything, and He knew what was going to happen anyway. He knew that He wasn't going to allow Abraham to sacrifice his son. And one of the first women who responded, I don't know who it was, like she said, I don't think I'd be able to sacrifice my children. As much as you love God and you want to please Him, I don't think I could do that. So I give Him a lot of credit, I suppose, even though God knew, Abraham didn't really know.
Yeah,
You know
so,
what I mean?
right, okay, Sue, yeah. So this is a test of his faith, that God is going to do everything God said He was going to do. And that's really the big test there. Because God's told him this is going to happen, okay? I know this, somehow my son is going to lie, and the covenant is going to go through my son Isaac, because God's already said that. And so that part's there. So then we leave from that scene there, and Sarah ends up dying. Abraham does remarry and have, surprisingly, a few other children through some other wives, but then eventually Abraham will die. But before that happens, he sends his servant off to his family in order to get a wife for Isaac. And so he ends up getting a wife for Isaac, Rachel, and we get into this whole thing, and she ends up having these two kids, Esau and Jacob. And they're told right at the beginning that things are going to come through Jacob. What?
I have a question before that.
Yeah, sure.
It says in here you have,
Mm-hmm.
where was it? Ishmael mocked Isaac. I don't remember.
Yeah, he mocks this is back when.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How did he mock him? I don't remember that.
He mocks him. It says in scripture he mocks him, and
Just say-
Sarah gets upset and says, "Send them away."
I thought that was.
And,
his
and
mother. I
God,
thought it
and
was his
God
mother who was
okays
giving-
that and said, God
Okay.
okays that and says, yes, you can send them away.
I thought that was Hagar who was giving Sarah the grief, not Isaac.
Hagar was giving Sarai the relief when she was pregnant
Okay.
initially, and she runs away, then God sends her back. She has the kid Ishmael, Ishmael's born. By the time Ishmael is 13, he's making fun of Isaac and
Okay.
doing things, so Sarah says, hey, no one should, send him away. So he gives him some provision, sends him away, and at that point we have a touching scene of Hagar, they're about to die, and Hagar laying him down away because she doesn't want to see him die, and the angel comes, and voila, there's a big oasis there and lots of water, and they get rescued. And we learn the thing that Ishmael will always be at war with his brothers, but in Abraham's death, the interesting thing is that Ishmael and Isaac come together to bury Abraham. And that's one of the things that occurs. But in Isaac's life, we get to Esau and Jacob, and that's they're the real part. And even though Isaac knows Jacob, it's supposed to go through Jacob, he favors Esau. Esau's kind of the man's man, out there hunting, doing things, manly kind of guy, Jacob is the nerd. He's not the manly man. And so Isaac tends to side with the Esau thing. Esau, though, has no regard for any of the traditions or anything. He sells his birthright for a bowl of soup. And he then goes on from selling his birthright, basically an inheritance. An important thing to always understand is an inheritance back then consisted of two parts, a birthright and a blessing. So the birthright meant that when dividing it up, at a minimum, and this was later on in Jewish law, but at a minimum what would happen is the one with the birthright got a double portion. And then what was left over was just kind of divided up amongst those that would get. The blessing, that established position and authority of the person in the whole household. So a person could have a birthright but not get a blessing, and vice versa.
What is one without the other?
Yeah, you could have one without the other.
But what is one without the other?
Well, if you got the birthright, you got a bunch of stuff, maybe a bunch of land, possessions, things like that. But if, say, someone else got the blessing, they might have authority over you. So you own the stuff, but they're your boss. Type of thing. If that makes any sense.
Why is it that they can only give one blessing? Why can't they bless all their children?
We do see that. We'll see it later when Jacob blesses all the children in Egypt and go through. Now, as you go through those blessings, some of them aren't real blessings, but but yes, but blessings do go through. What happens here with Isaac is we have this great big deception that occurs, where Rebecca finds out that, okay, Isaac's about to give Esau his blessing to make sure he gets something. Now, Isaac doesn't die till much, much later, but he wanted to make sure he was given his blessing. And he's not seeing well, he's blind, so he sends Esau off to to go do the hunt and to fix it the way he likes it, and then to bring it to him, and then after they have a good meal together, voila, he'll give him his blessings so that Esau would definitely have it, since he no longer has the birthright. Well, Rebecca finds out about it, gets her son Jacob, says let's deceive. You got this almost comical thing of putting hair on his hands and everything, and dressing him up in Esau's clothes so he smells the right way and he kind of feels the right way. And then she fixes up the meal so that it's the way Isaac likes it, and sends Jacob in to do it. And voila, Jacob gets the blessing, and this blessing that Isaac gives is whole hog. It covers everything. There's nothing left in order to give a blessing. And that's why Isaac doesn't have anything left. He says, hey, I've given you the whole thing to Jacob. And so when Esau finally comes in and they realize the deception happened, that's why Esau's mad. He plots to murder his brother, and Rebecca and Isaac sends him away to the family that Rebecca came from, to Rebecca's brother Laban. And so Jacob goes off to do that and flees. Now, you should note throughout these stories, okay, Abraham was a really righteous guy. Isaac, so far, we don't hear a whole lot about righteousness. We don't hear a whole lot about godliness. He just kind of is. And a lot of times he's trying to do things that he knows weren't right, like trying to give Esau the blessing. He knows everything's supposed to go through Jacob, but he's not doing it. So there's some problems there. And now Jacob, he ain't, he's willing to lie to get what he wants. He's willing to deceive. And as he's fleeing and running away, he has that time where he sleeps with his head on a rock, and he has the vision that we call Jacob's ladder, of the stairway going up to heaven, angels ascending and descending. And he says, okay, this is a holy spot. So he prays there, but he prays in the sense of a covenant. But this is more like a transactional agreement. God, if you do X, Y, and Z for me, then God, I will do A, B, and C for you.
We all do that.
Yeah?
I used to do that. I think I still do. Please, I'll do this and that.
Yeah, so Jacob's a real transactional kind of guy. And he just wants, so we're not seeing a real super depth of faith with Jacob either. And I'm pointing this out, and I'm highlighting it because you've got to really understand how real all these people are. If you ever think, gee, I'm not anything like any of these godly people in the Bible, think again. We most certainly are. So Jacob, he goes there and he meets Laban. He ends up falling in love right off the bat with Rachel, because she's beautiful. So-so. He likes Rachel. He says he's going to work for her. Laban deceives him and instead gives him Leah, and then says, if you work another 7 years, you can have Rachel. What we'll do is just fulfill her marriage week, Leah's marriage week, and then you can have Rachel and have a marriage week with her, but then you got to work 7 years after that. So he ends up being there for 14 years, working just for the thing. So he's not earning anything, he's just working for these two women. But during the process here, Leah is the one that has children and starts having children. And the significance of this is we see now the children that form the basis for the 12 tribes of Israel. And this is the beginning of God really, living up to the covenant he made with Abraham, that he's going to have great nations come from Abraham. And so we go through the different sons, and we got, Reuben being the first, and then Simeon, Levi, and Judah, and each have a name attached to what their name means. There becomes this little thing back and forth between Leah and Rachel, and then they start giving their handmaidens to, Jacob in order to have children through them, because they're just within this great competition. Who can have more kids? Because through the kids, then we'll get the bigger parts of the inheritance. This ain't godly. This ain't a good marriage. I wouldn't go taking any marriage advice from Jacob, Rachel, and Leah. But God is able to still work good things through it and bless it. And Jacob continues to grow in this kind of material prosperity. Laban changes his wages, does also things, but somehow Jacob continues to be blessed over and over and over again. And eventually they get to the point, once he has all these children, 12 primarily, and we hear about one daughter, Diane. That's only because we hear it later, but we know there's other kids than just that. Because we know when they run away, they got other children but that. We find that this prosperity and stuff he's worried that Laban's going to take it all away from him, because Laban has authority over Jacob. And in the Middle East custom, as long as he's in this area, he's under Laban's authority. And so everything that he's earned so far and made, Laban has authority over and can take away from him at any time. And so that makes them afraid that if we stick around, this jealousy that's brewing up between Laban and Laban's other kids and them might be negative for them. So Jacob hears from God to leave and to go back to his land, and Jacob says, yep, it's a good time to do it. And so if you look in those verses talking about them going back, it focuses really the wives, when they're discussing amongst themselves about going back, they're not talking so much about, well, God told Jacob to go back. Their conversation's more about, well, if we stick around here, we might lose everything. We better go. And then we even hear the story in there, in verse, where it says, and you really see how bad Rachel is and unrighteous she is in a way. What does she do? She steals her father's gods. And so they run off. That causes Laban to come after them. But then God tells Laban not to harm him. And so it results in kind of like a little peace treaty and agreement, and he's allowed to go off with everything. We have the reunion of Jacob and Esau that occurs. We find Esau is not out to kill Jacob anymore. Esau's in agreement. But you really see in that story how Jacob values things, because he's worried about Esau coming after him with some armed men to kill him and to kill him and to take everything. And so he divides up all that he has by his wives And how he positions them tells you what he thinks is most valuable. So Leah's handmaidens up front, then you got Leah. So it's like he really doesn't care about that. Those handmaidens, Leah, yeah, they're okay. Rachel's at the tail end. She's most important. But then we see a glimmer of hope in Jacob. This little glimmer of righteousness in this ordering, because then the one part, he puts himself in front of everything else. So while he has the succession of his possessions in order, this is after he has already sent gifts forward to Esau, he places himself in front of everybody else, which kind of says, okay, he is a good guy after all. But his thought is, okay, if he comes to attack, he's gonna knock me down, kill me, he'll start killing this, but that'll give the time for the stuff in the back to leave and flee. But so he does that, and his brother though greets him with a kiss, and they make up. But even in that, then Jacob lies to his brother. And Jacob says, yeah, I'll follow you, brother. I'll be right there. But then he doesn't. He goes the other way.
Doesn't learn.
Yeah, well, he just goes the other way, and that's okay. They have a whole situation. You kind of see how he's settled in an area. They're in this town, and it's Shechem, and a person, they call him a prince. He's in some translation. He wants to marry Diane. He loves her so much he ends up raping her in a way, but at the same time it's kind of consensual, because it doesn't say that Diane really objected or anything like that. And then he's willing to marry her and do whatever he wants. They come to a fake agreement, and it's fake because, unknown to Jacob, his sons don't plan to uphold it. And so why the guys all get circumcised so that they can supposedly intermarry in the family, what happens is the two of the brothers go through and they kill everybody. Now, you gotta understand, again, towns in that time, we're not talking a big place. So we're talking maybe 25, 30 men and their families. So if they're all incapacitated, yes, then they could go through with a couple swords and bump everybody off. Which is basically what they did. None of that is directed by God. None of that's pleasing to God. Please take note that at no time Jacob said, gee, let me ask God what he thinks we should do. I hope you notice all those kind of things in the story as we go on. This is Jacob blundering around, literally blundering around. So Rachel has her last child, Benjamin, dies in childbirth, and she is buried at what is today Bethlehem. And if you go to Bethlehem, you can actually see a thing called Rachel's tomb and all that. Whether good old Rachel's actually there at that particular spot, probably not. We just know it's in the general area there somewhere, but we don't know the specific location. But there is a traditional location that builds up. And then we find out after that, Isaac finally dies. and Esau and Jacob get together again to bury Isaac once more. We then jump into the story that's going to unfold about Joseph. And this last set, there, remember in the very beginning when we were talking about Genesis, there were these 11 sets of generations that it's called. And so this is the last set that we're going to be talking about, and when we deal with the story of Joseph. And here it is pretty well a complete narrative except for this odd chapter. So it starts in 37 dealing with Joseph, and then we have this odd chapter 38 stuck in the middle there, which seems so weird to us, that talks about Judah. So I'm going to just talk about that odd chapter that's stuck in there, and then we'll deal with Joseph as one full narrative. So this odd chapter talking about Judah. Also, out of the blue, it talks about Judah and him going off and being married, having kids, and then getting his kid's a wife, and then his oldest gets married to Tamar. He bites the dust, doesn't have any kids, so he says, okay, well, Tamar, you got to marry my next kid then. And she does, and then he bites the dust, and they kind of feel it's cursed, and then he doesn't fulfill what he's supposed to do and give him to the next kid as grow up. So you got to realize in chapter 38, a very lengthy period of time transpires. That period of time that transpires in 38, it is covering this whole period of time when Joseph is down in Egypt and prior to the thing. So we're talking literally decades go by and are all in chapter 38. So it's like you do the events in 37 and Joseph gets sold into slavery, and then all of a sudden we're talking about Judah's life, and it takes this whole time. You know, they cover whole decades, and then they say, well, let's go back now to Joseph, and they go back in time to pick up where we left Joseph off. But the significance of this is, one, to see this helps establish why the blessing is the way it is later, that Jacob will give to his kids at the end of Genesis. It will also, though, show you that the righteousness that God brings about and the sovereign will of God that we see throughout Scripture is not dependent on us. So Jacob goes off, he goes to sleep with what he thinks is a prostitute. It turns out it's Tamar. Tamar gets pregnant. He wants to burn her to death. But then she pulls out his staff and his stuff and says, see, this is the man I slept with. And he realized, uh-oh, it's me. Those are my kids. And then she has twins. And it's through those twins, specifically Perez, that David is a descendant of. And later, the line of Christ comes through. And so that's how this whole story kind of fits in there. It gives us this microcosm right off the bat that, hey, here is how the covenant's being carried on through Judah, who's the fourth born, remember, not the first, not the second, fourth born. but it's gonna come through this particular line. And it shows you how kind of really unrighteous Judah is. He ain't a godly guy. None of them are real godly except for Joseph. And, you know, this helps us really to understand how God's grace is working and comes through that. And is not dependent on us for his sovereign will to be exercised and be done. Yeah.
So here Joseph is the godly one, and Joseph gets the end of the short stick in a way,
Well,
because he gets
so let's-
sold, goes through mistreatment,
Yeah, so let's-
prison.
Yep, let's go to Joseph then. So Joseph, you know, he has these visions, and we see some of the symbolism in those visions that's normal in the Bible. He has the visions of the sun and the moon and the stars all bowing down to him. And Jacob even kind of hits Joseph back on that, and this is in chapter 37. He hits back at him and he says, hey, am I and your mother and your brothers all gonna bow down? Because that's the sun, moon, and stars were always symbolism for father, mother, and the sons. And so that's part of the symbolism of it. Specifically, that's in chapter 37, verses 9 through 11. And it's at the end of verse 10 where he says, what kind of dream is this that you've had? Shall we indeed come, I and your mother and your brothers, and bow down to the ground to you? And this symbolism, just so you know, you ought to keep that symbolism in mind, because you see it later on in the prophets. We'll see it multiple times be used. But all this, I mean, Joseph's kind of a braggart. Hey, look at these great dreams I have. Now I got this nice coat too that because my dad likes me so much, because, hey, my mom was Rachel and she's dead and he really still pines for her a lot. So I get all the nice stuff from that. And the brothers are jealous of him. And obviously Jacob is favoring them while they're out doing work. He's back home. And then he sends him to go see what they're doing, kind of spy on them, and then report back. So they're very jealous. They end up beating him up, selling him into slavery. They were going to kill him. They get kind of talked out of it because they get greedy and they want money instead. Reuben tries to stop it all from happening, but he walks away, and when he walks away, that's when they decide to just go for the Godot and sell him into slavery. And they create a whole lie. They tell him that he got killed. They show him a coat that they used with sheep blood, and it gives this impression, and Jacob's just devastated by it. We then pick up with Joseph, and when he gets sold down into slavery, a guy named Potiphar, who was the captain of the guard. And what that means is he was the guard of Pharaoh. He was like the inner guard. It would be like the equivalent of the captain of the Secret Service, guarding the White House. So as captain of the guard, he had power. He buys Joseph and sets him to work. And we're told right off the bat, because Joseph is so godly and so righteous and with God, he is continually blessed. And so he rises up very, very quickly. And he rises up to the point where Potiphar puts him in charge of his whole household. everything he has. And almost in kind of a parallelism with how Judah just goes and sleeps with who a lady he thinks is a prostitute and doesn't think twice about it. We got Joseph, and Potiphar's wife wants him to have an affair with her, and he won't do it, and he refuses to. And so what happens is she fakes it, that he attacks her, and then demands that Potiphar do something. A significant part in this story is we see how much Potiphar really must like Joseph, and how much Potiphar probably doesn't believe his wife, because he could just have Joseph killed. And in fact, normally that would be a slave assaulting his wife. Oh my gosh. But instead he puts him in prison. Which isn't a norm. That's actually merciful. So some see in that about Potiphar, some see that as a continual thing of God's mercy. But in all these cases, what you always have to see is that God is placing Joseph in specific positions at different time in order to help build what he's about to transpire and bring about. Through Potiphar, he comes close to Pharaoh's court. He gets an understanding of Pharaoh's court and that whole area. Through being in that prison, he meets the chief baker and the cupbearer. And he ends up interpreting their dream because they were in prison. And the cupbearer has a good dream, and the chief baker not so good. And the cupbearer in 3 days will get restored to his position of being the cupbearer and making sure the Pharaoh ain't getting poisoned. And the chief baker, unfortunately, in 3 days will get his head chopped off and be posted, hung up, and the birds will be eating out of his head. Not a pleasant sight. And that comes true, and the cupbearer forgets to tell Pharaoh, as Joseph had asked. And then 2 years later, we transport this whole time of 2 years later, but in that time, Joseph is doing so well in prison that the prison guards kind of have him in being the head prisoner in the prison, in charge of everything and taking care of the prison. Well, Pharaoh has his dream. The dream, as we know, are the seven fat cows coming up, and then the 7 lean cows coming up, and the 7 lean cows eat the 7 fat cows. And then we got the same thing with wheat. And it's at that time then when none of the magicians, none of the people in Pharaoh's court can interpret Pharaoh's dream, that the cupbearer goes, oh, I could have had a V8. No, that he says, I remember now that this guy Joseph could interpret dreams. And so Pharaoh brings him up and says, hey, and you should note in there that they wash Joseph up, they get him all clean and good, because nothing dirty could come into Pharaoh's presence. And they get him all ready and everything, and so they bring him in then, and Pharaoh says, I understand you can interpret dreams, and Joseph says, I can't interpret them, but God can interpret them. And God gives me the interpretation. And so we see time and time again, constantly, Joseph's ability there. And Joseph does interpret the dreams, tell him that, God let him know you're going to have great 7 prosperous years, but then 7 years of famine. And it's going to be horrible. Joseph even has an idea or a plan as to what to do. And Pharaoh turns around and appoints Joseph into the position of being in charge of it, of carrying out the plan. In fact, makes him what would be the equivalent today of a prime minister position. He's second only to Pharaoh. He even has Pharaoh's signet ring, which means he has the authority of Pharaoh in all his decisions. And Joseph does that plan, pulls it together, you know about it. During the 7 prosperous years, they bring in stock, they stockpile, builds up their reserves. Archaeologically, they have found these great like storage bins, storage areas in Egypt, dating back to about this time period, that might have been used for something like that, that was obviously used for storing a lot of food. Due to the way Egyptian records were kept, and one pharaoh wiping out the records of another pharaoh, the Egyptians weren't too good about recording disastrous times or bad times. So there is no Egyptian record of a big 7 years of famine. So that's not there, but they have found vast storage bins that date back to the time, and they believe that possibly provide archaeological evidence for Joseph's plan of building up the thing, building up. So the famine comes, we go through a couple years of the famine, and then what happens is we go back to Joseph's brothers and Jacob. And, you know, it's kind of, you get that image of them in chapter 42 there. When Jacob learned that there was grain in Egypt, he said to his sons, "Why do you keep looking at one another?" You know, bunch of doofus just standing around doing nothing. Go down there and get it. So we have this whole story of them going down to get it, and Joseph accusing them of being spies, and they this play back and forth, and you got even though the story moves along quickly, you got to understand the length of time that goes through. That we're talking about a few years go by as they're going back and forth, and in the end, finally, Joseph reveals who he is. Kind of once he's feeled out his brothers and tested them, he reveals who he is and lets them know. They're overjoyed, but of course scared. He gets them, because the famine's still going to be going on for a while, he gets them to bring the father down, invites them down to Egypt. He also lets his brothers know, and a significant part in chapter 45 there is verse 7, where he says, "God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on earth, and to keep alive for you many survivors. So it was not you who sent me here, but God. He has made me father to Pharaoh and lord of all the house and ruler over all the land of Egypt." And that's a really significant thing, that Joseph absolves them of other guilt. He's not looking for vengeance or anything like that. He says, hey, you didn't do it, God did it. So something that seems really bad wasn't bad. It was done for a very specific reason. And it's preserving this line. Now, as we go through this, they do finally come down to Egypt. They're brought down with big fanfare and everything. But we see in the brothers time and time again throughout these last chapters in Genesis, they're always worried about Joseph turning around, getting mad at him, and seeking vengeance. No matter how much Joseph has reassured him, look.
I would too.
Well, but that's in their spirit, and it shows how, instead of just saying, "Oh, Joseph, we're sorry," they're always, "Oh, well, how can we counter Joseph on this? How can we make sure he doesn't?" We never hear the brothers say, "Oh, we are so sorry. We goofed up. We have sinned, or we did that." No. They're just saying, "Well, he might still be mad at us about this. How can we figure this out?" Well, the big part comes down later. And because of the way the famine goes, basically Joseph, in this prime minister, he gets more and more of authority. And this really sets the stage for later on, because everyone sells all their land to Pharaoh in order to get food. They go through they first go through buying everything they could, but then they run out of that. Then they start trading. Okay, here's all our animals and livestock. Oh, now here's all our land. So by the end, what you have, and now this part is actually in Egyptian history and recorded, what occurs under one pharaoh is it goes from being a pharaoh in charge where people have private ownership type thing of their own land to being a king, and everyone's a vassal of the king and a servant of the king. And that's a really important change that occurs, because that's going to set up the slavery that's going to occur later on to the Israelites long after Joseph. You know, while they're there for 400 years, because that form of government then that occurs in Egypt, that then will carry on all the way through for the next 400 some years and on up, where everybody works for the king. So we get Jacob. Jacob's dying, and he takes Joseph's two sons and he makes them his own son. They belong to him now. And we then have his blessing, Jacob's blessing, in chapter 47 going all the way through 49. And I got a kind of a summary there on the sheets for you. So Reuben, you got a lot of promise, but you're a big disappointment. There's a blessing for you, right? Simeon, you know, your seed's just going to be scattered all over. Judah, the scepter's not going to depart from him. So Judah, the ruling is going to go through it, and this is a prophecy of Christ coming through it, and the covenant kind of being fulfilled, nations being blessed, and it's going to come through Judah, and that's the key line in the blessing for him. Zebulun, he gets to live by the sea. Issachar, strong, hard work. Dan, you're going to be judges, but you're going to be harsh. Gad, perpetual harassment, total state of conflict. And each of these blessings, as you go through, you see these in the tribe. You see these characteristics in the people later on. And you can kind of hang on to that piece from Genesis, and you see it later on in Samuel and in Kings and Chronicles, in how they act and what they do, what the different tribes do, and through Judges also. Benjamin, warlike, never satisfied, live off of plunder. So you see all of that. Joseph receives the big blessing. He receives the main blessing that kind of transfers all the prosperity to him, and he's very singular. So this, that's kind of a big part, but notice the scepter and the ruling part that's gonna go on for generation isn't through Joseph. Joseph's role, the whole reason for being, is over now. His reason for being was to preserve the remnant, to preserve Israel. And so then through that preservation, this is now turning this small motley nomadic group, it's gonna begin creating it into a nation, which later than Moses is gonna have to really get it into that group as a nation. We then jump all the way to Joseph's death at 110. It says he calls his brothers, and a lot of times people say, well, what about, a lot of his brothers have to be dead by now or something, because they were older than him. And the term that's actually used there in the Hebrew is male relatives. And it gets translated into brothers, but it's really male relatives. And he lets them know that God's going to come to an aid. And that kind of is an indication to us that there's already some trouble brewing. And they finalizes by saying, hey, when I die and bite the dust, take me with you. When you leave here, take my body with you and bury me up there. We hear about Joseph being embalmed, and that's so much different than Jewish burial. Jewish burial, they wrap the body up so it doesn't stink, and even back then, and then what they would do is once the decay took place, they break the bones apart and they put the bones into a bone box. So instead of being in a big casket, you're in this little bone box. And so a lot of times they said, well, there's nobody, we've never found up in Israel archaeologically a person that was embalmed. Well, back in just in 2018, they did discover a body of an embalmed person who was in, and they believed that would have been Joseph. And it was different than any of the other bodies that was ever uncovered or discovered. So that, that was another archaeological discovery that helps to confirm more the story of Genesis. So there we go. That's that part. Next week we do the entire book of Exodus. And then we'll finally be caught up. So look through the whole book of Exodus. You should be reading. If you're following that reading plan, like I said, that's in the newsletter, that will keep you on track for reading through the whole Bible. And that's basically what we're following along here. Okay? All right. Just 10 minutes after you. See, Chris, it wasn't until 8 o'clock. That's what you sent to me. Oh, Sherry's showing me here a picture too. Hi, Sherry. All right.
All right, have a good night, everyone.
Okay. Have a good night. See y'all.
Good night,
Bye.
everyone. Bye.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
All right. Okay.